There's a moment that arrives quietly, almost like a small panic, when someone approaches you with a warm smile, and you realize you have absolutely no idea what their name is. You know their face, you remember conversations you've had, you might even recall details about their life, but their name? Gone, completely erased from your mind. And as they talk to you, expecting familiarity, you're frantically searching your memory for something that isn't there. You've probably felt it, that flush of embarrassment, that split-second decision between admitting you forgot or faking your way through the conversation. And if you're someone who forgets names constantly, you know the guilt that comes with it, the worry that people think you don't care, that you're rude, that you weren't paying attention, when the truth is, you were. You just can't hold on to names the way other people seem to. People who never remember names aren't careless. They're not disinterested or dismissive. They're just wired differently. Their brains prioritize certain types of information and deprioritize others. And names, for whatever reason, fall into the category their mind treats as optional. Not because they want it that way, but because that's how their memory works. There's a psychology behind this that has nothing to do with respect, because forgetting someone's name doesn't mean you forgot them. It just means your brain filed their identity differently, under their face, their voice, the feeling of being around them, but not under the arbitrary label everyone else agreed to call them. And in a world where remembering names is treated as a sign of caring, people who can't do it feel like failures. Like they're walking around committing tiny social crimes, disappointing people without meaning to, creating awkward moments that could have been avoided if their brain just worked the way it's supposed to. But here's the thing, their brain is working, just differently. And understanding why can make the difference between shame and self-compassion. Psychologists have studied this for years, and what they found is that people who forget names often have what's called weak verbal associative memory. That's the part of memory that links arbitrary labels to objects or people. And for some people, that connection is fragile. It forms, but it doesn't stick. The name goes in, but it doesn't anchor to anything solid. So when they try to recall it later, there's nothing to pull, just a blank space where the name should be. But those same people often have incredible memory for other things: faces, stories, conversations, emotions, patterns, context. They can remember exactly where they met someone, what they talked about, how that person made them feel. They just can't remember the name because their brain prioritizes meaning over labels, experience over titles. And that's not a flaw, it's just a different way of storing information. Most people who struggle with names developed this pattern early, not because they weren't trying, but because names are abstract. They're sounds that don't inherently mean anything. Unlike faces, which are visual and concrete, names are just arbitrary phonetic combinations. And if your brain doesn't naturally link sounds to meaning, names become the hardest thing to hold on to. It's made worse by the way we're introduced to people. Someone says a name once, usually in a moment where you're processing multiple things: their appearance, their handshake, the social context, what you're supposed to say next, and your brain, already overloaded, treats the name as background noise, something less important than the immediate task of making a good impression. So the name never gets encoded properly. It goes in, but it doesn't stick. And by the time you need it again, it's gone. There's a particular kind of anxiety that comes with never remembering names, because every introduction becomes a test you know you'll fail, every social gathering becomes a minefield of people whose names you should know but don't, and the longer you go without asking, the worse it gets. Because now it's not just forgetting, it's having forgotten for so long that asking feels like admitting you never cared in the first place. So you develop strategies. You avoid using names altogether. You say, "hey," instead of their name. You refer to people by context. The person from the meeting, your friend who likes hiking. You become an expert at conversational gymnastics, all to hide the fact that you have no idea what anyone is called. And the exhausting part is that people notice. They notice when you don't use their name, when you hesitate, when you clearly can't remember, and they interpret it as indifference, as rudeness, as proof that you don't value them, when the truth is, you're just working with a brain that doesn't prioritize that specific type of information. People who forget names often share something in common. They're more focused on the emotional texture of interactions than the factual details. They remember how someone made them feel, the energy they brought, the way the conversation flowed. But names, which exist outside that emotional context, don't register the same way. They're filed separately, and sometimes they're not filed at all. And here's what makes it harder. Society places enormous weight on remembering names. It's treated as the baseline of respect. If you cared, you'd remember my name. But that equation isn't fair, because memory doesn't work that way. You can care deeply about someone and still forget their name. Those things aren't connected, except in how we judge them. There's a strange shame that comes with this, because forgetting names makes you feel defective, like everyone else got a manual on how to be a functioning social human, and you missed that page. You watch other people effortlessly recall names of people they met once years ago, and you wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you do something so basic, something that seems to come naturally to everyone else? And that shame compounds because the more anxious you become about forgetting names, the harder it is to remember them. Your brain, already struggling, now has the added pressure of performance anxiety, and anxiety shuts down the exact processes you need for memory formation, so you forget more and feel worse, and the cycle continues.
I remember the first time I realized I had a real problem with names. I was at an event, and someone I'd met several times approached me. I knew their face, I remembered conversations we'd had, I even remembered that they had a dog named Charlie. But their name? Completely gone. And when they said, "Good to see you again," I felt that familiar dread, because I knew I should know, and I didn't. And admitting it felt like confessing I didn't care, even though I did. I just couldn't hold on to that one piece of information. If you've been there, you know the spiral, the internal debate. Do I ask again and risk looking like I wasn't listening the first 3 times? Or do I keep pretending and hope it doesn't come up? And either choice feels wrong, because asking makes you look careless, but not asking means continuing the charade. The hardest part about forgetting names is that it affects relationships, because people feel seen when you remember their name. It signals that they matter, that they registered, that they made an impact. And when you forget, even if it's not personal, it feels personal to them, like they were forgettable, like they didn't leave a mark. And no amount of explaining that you remember everything else about them seems to fix that hurt. Because names are tied to identity, to selfhood, and forgetting someone's name, even accidentally, can feel like forgetting them, even when that's not true at all. Here's what most people don't understand about those who forget names. They're not forgetting you, they're forgetting a label, and to them, the label is the least important part of who you are. They remember your kindness, your laugh, the story you told, the way you made them feel. But the arbitrary word everyone calls you, that's the part that slips away. Not because it doesn't matter, but because their brain doesn't hold on to abstractions the way it holds on to experiences. And that distinction is important, because forgetting a name isn't the same as forgetting a person. It's just forgetting one small piece of data that to some brains feels disconnected from everything else. Psychologists talk about something called selective attention. It's the brain's way of deciding what to focus on and what to filter out. And for people who forget names, names often get filtered, not consciously, but automatically, because the brain is busy processing other information it deems more relevant: facial recognition, emotional tone, social dynamics, context. And in that processing, the name gets deprioritized, treated as secondary, and sometimes lost entirely. It's not a choice, it's how their attention naturally distributes itself. And while it creates social friction, it doesn't reflect how much they care, it just reflects how their brain organizes information. So what do you do when you're someone who never remembers names, when every introduction feels like a setup for failure? You stop treating it like a moral failing. You accept that your brain works differently, and you develop workarounds. You ask for names again without shame. You write them down.
You create mnemonic devices. You repeat names immediately after hearing them. You use them in conversation to reinforce the connection. And most importantly, you stop apologizing for being wired differently. You stop letting people make you feel like a bad person because you can't do something their brain does easily. Because memory is diverse, and struggling with one type doesn't mean you're failing at being human. It just means you're human in a different way. Here's the shift that matters. You learn to communicate what you do remember. When you forget someone's name, you tell them what you haven't forgotten. I'm terrible at names, but I remember you told me about your trip to Portugal. How was that? And suddenly, the conversation isn't about what's missing, it's about what's present, the connection, the care, the fact that you were paying attention, even if the name didn't stick. Because people who forget names aren't checked out, they're often deeply engaged. They're just engaged with different details. And when you show them that, when you prove that forgetting their name didn't mean forgetting them, the sting softens, the offense fades, and they realize that maybe, just maybe, you were paying attention in a way that mattered more than labels. People who never remember names aren't broken. They're not rude. They're not careless. They're just working with a brain that prioritizes connection over nomenclature, experience over titles, feeling over filing systems. And in a world that judges memory by one narrow metric, that difference feels like failure. But it's not. It's just different. And different doesn't mean less. You're allowed to forget names and still care deeply. You're allowed to struggle with labels and still value people. You're allowed to have a memory that works beautifully in some areas and struggles in others. Because memory isn't a monolith, it's a spectrum. And wherever you fall on it, you're enough. And maybe the most important thing to remember is this: the people who truly know you will understand. They'll see past the forgotten name to the remembered conversation, past the awkward hesitation to the genuine interest, past the label to the person underneath who's been paying attention all along, just not to the part everyone else thinks matters most. You don't have to remember names to remember people. You just have to remember what actually matters. And if you're doing that, you're doing just fine.